Okay. All right. Anything lingering from last week we should talk about or clear up or ready to go on? All right. So I have the video queued up. I start just a minute or so of review before we end the spot where we ended. And then the plan is this video is actually like an hour and a half long, but after 51 minutes, it degenerated into kind of the same kind of question over and over. So we'll stop that one there and then switch to a different video I found that's involves some more people and a more technical discussion. So the idea is we're trying to do kind of a spiral around this idea, and we're little by little we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it. Is
And
what I'm up to. And
which,
then we might be able to finish that all to this week. And then next week I have something very different with two other scholars who both work on this issue, but come at it from slightly different perspectives. And so we'll hear what they think and a little bit of criticism of Saito's approach.
Richard,
Uh-huh.
when you say we're spiraling around this and this issue, what exactly is this and this issue?
Well, the core ideas of the book.
Okay.
What it is degrowth, what is the relationship with Marx's thinking,
Okay.
what's the whole, we'll I think at the then a little bit later we'll skip back to him and we're going to come back at the why this kind of I found a piece that talks more about this kind of cultural program that he's on about of enlivening our imagination as a form of political struggle. So we should come back to that if we I think we'll have time to come back to that. Depending how next week goes. That one's going to be a little more technical, so it might involve more even more explaining than usual from me. But we'll see what we can do with all that. So that's the plan going forward. Let me share and we'll get started. Alrighty.
This problem of equality and sustainability under the persistency of the society, this is related to each other. The problem of equality and sustainability
Oops, sorry.
is related. That is why he was so excited about Russian communes. And then in his very last stage of his life, the Russian revolutionary Vera Zasulich asks question, oh, capitalism is coming to Russia. Would it be necessary for Russian communes to get destroyed by the power of capital? And then comes the socialist revolution. And then Marx says, no, what I talked about only applies to the Western societies. But then he continues. Even the Western societies are now facing the crisis of capitalism. And then the solution for this crisis is to return to a higher form of archaic commune. And he says, returning to commune life, but and of course in higher form. Why? Because he was realized that kind of the equality and sustainability are closely related, and that these kind of conditions were satisfied under those communes. So he learned, he was inspired. So he even says Western society needs to learn from those communes and they have to internalize some of the principles. What is the principle? Social equality, as I said, communality, and then sustainability under the persistency of the economic system, which is basically steady state. This is why those communes have been there for many, many years, hundreds, but thousands of years. Marx despised this in the 50s. This invariability of these communes must be destroyed by British imperialism and so on. But in the 80s, he changed his evaluation.
Okay, so that's sort of the core of the critique of Marx being Eurocentric in his thinking, is that in the 1850s, when he's looking at what's happening in India, so think about India in the 1850s. This is full on, British colonialism in India. Marx, he's looked at European history and this history with capitalism, and then he looks at India and he sees these old forms of economic activity in those communes, and he thinks at the time that the British coming in and through the sort of force of the colonial project destroying those communes. And his thinking is, well, okay, but those communes are stuck in this really old form of life. And think about what would rural India be like in the 1850s. So he's thinking that's a life that we want to break people out of so that they can have more freedom. But in particular, you want to think about it in terms of what are life prospects? What are the possibilities for the individuals in this society to do? And in those communes, as Marx looked at them, he's seeing that they're just sort of stuck in this very primitive lifestyle that they can't possibly get out of. And so therefore destroying them is good. But what Saito's getting at is after a couple of decades of more experience and learning more about the rest of the world, he changes his mind about what he thinks about these communes in terms of their role in history. And so that's what's going on with this conversation about the communes that existed in Russia before the Russian Revolution. They were, and the communes were interesting in Russia because my impression is, again, I'm not a historian of Russia, so this is just my impression, was that they were largely outside of the feudal structure that was the kind of general reality of Tsarist Russia. That they're off in the countryside somewhere, and so the czars over time were used to them being there, and since they weren't presenting any kind of threat, they were just sort of allowed to continue on. But they were maintaining this more egalitarian structure, and so in that way, very different than the structure of Tsarist Russia with the hierarchy of a czar. So this is the half the big, there were these two big halves that Saito's arguing in Marx's thinking. One's about the environmentalism, and then the other is about the process in his philosophy of history, his historical materialism. So this is a big change in that philosophy of history, that all of a sudden he's saying, okay, Marx is now imagining a way out in which he sees the negation. Remember, we got to keep this in Hegelian terminology. He sees the negation of the primitive commune as a good thing historically, but it has to be done in the service of the higher negation that brings it in sort of around capitalism and sort of brings it post-capitalist in its thinking. So he's not saying we want to leave that alone as a model and try to emulate it. He's still saying, no, the means of production are still very primitive. Life opportunities are still too limited. So that even those commune forms need to change. There needs to be some sort of negation, but the recovery of that, then he imagines, will actually keep a lot of the form, but just add other kinds of details in terms of having access to different ways of producing things, rather than 19th century technology. What would this look like if these communes could be reorganized in a way that they were making use of 20th century technology, or for our time, 21st century technology, but still maintained those properties that allowed them to persist so long, the communality, the equality, the sustainability. Anyway, so I just want to point out that this is one of the really big claims that he's making in terms of how to understand Marx, is that this change is not just him interpreting Marx and offering a new interpretation. It's him saying Marx himself changed, and the evidence is in those notebooks. Nina?
Did I hear him say that Marx didn't think this could happen in Russia?
At one time.
So that those communes were not what he thought were going to develop.
Well, it's more that what he's so I mean, the idea is this: the woman that he's corresponding with in Russia is asking, okay, your theory said these communes of ours have to go away. Is that really true? And so late in life, he's saying, no, they don't have to go away. They actually are a good thing as a model, but it is a model that needs to be updated.
So he switched his sort of focus early toward Western capital.
Yeah. Well, the idea is that he's looking at the history in Europe and thinking everywhere in the world where there's capitalism, that capitalism will have to take the same path that it took in Europe. And the idea is, well, capitalism is going to spread around and do things, but maybe, or probably after more, knowledge about the rest of the world, probably it's not going to look like it did in Europe. It will look different. And so he's having to make the theory more complicated to include more possibilities and more variety of forms in the world. Okay. All right. So we're about the point where we ended last week.
I think he sort of accepted, he corrected his productivism, he corrected his Eurocentrism, and then he abandoned this area of
productivism is the bit about sustainability, that instead of needing to rely on ever developing productive forces, that we have to think in terms of this steady state goal instead of more and more stuff.
A form of historical materialism, everything sort of changed. And then I think he became more open to the idea of steady state economy for the sake of establishing communism, which I call degrowth communism.
Thank you also for simplifying so much. So can we talk a bit more about this steady, stable, sustainable economy, about degrowth communism? Maybe to break it down even more, which concrete improvements could degrowth communism bring for the working class?
Okay, so although I'm a Marxiologist from the academic background, Marx never uses the term degrowth, right? So when I say degrowth communism is something compatible with Marx, this is a kind of political intervention, as I said in the very beginning. It's very important to learn for the contemporary Marxists, or I think the contemporary left in general, to learn from degrowth side and also talk about, other issues like decoloniality, feminism, and so on. But for my book, the degrowth communism is one of the central topics. And people often, even the left-wing people say, no, that's austerity. That's ecological dictatorship. We become poor because we try to, go back to nature kind of things. No, that's a misunderstanding. So let me explain what degrowth is. Degrowth is a project to abandon GDP as a measure of progress or prosperity. Because GDP doesn't measure social inequality, degrowth doesn't measure cleanness of the air, degrowth doesn't measure many, many things. So I think we need to have...
Well, true. And the other thing, on the other side, what GDP does measure is the response we have to disasters. So if a factory blows up and destroys a city, all of that rebuilding is counted into the GDP as productive activity, even though you may end up back sort of at zero. You have all this negative and then you build it up and you end up back where you started. But because you were doing all of this stuff responding to the disasters that you didn't need to cause in the first place, so there's long been an argument in environmental circles that using GDP as a measure of well-being is really kind of perverse. It's not capturing some things that matter, and then it counts these other things as sort of a net positive, even though they're really about just recovering from disasters. And that's kind of a strange way to measure progress. If all of your disaster response counts as a good thing. I mean, obviously responding to disaster is good, but economically good thing.
A more comprehensive measure that also includes well-being, sustainability, and so on and so on. That's first topic. And then degrowth doesn't demand, secondly, doesn't demand.
But this is the same as liberal degrowth thinkers would argue,
Yeah.
right? In this, this is not different from, yeah.
But then here comes this thing. So degrowth is about not scaling down everything. We scale down basically what is unnecessary. But unnecessary means very different meaning for different people. But I would include other advertisements, excessive, fast fashion, private jets, cruise ships, and all these kind of things could be much more fundamentally challenged. We should demand abolishment of those kind of excessive consumption, especially among the rich. Here comes the more socialist politics. And first, so we intervene. We can even like ask them to ban those things, industrial meat and so on and so on. We have
before he gets away from it too far. When you stop and think about it, sort of the things, there's a lot of aspects of our society and economy that if we were after real efficiency in the economy are totally counterproductive. So a lot of what happens with lawyers is counterproductive. Advertising is counterproductive. The way we have insurance companies managing our healthcare, and so each one of them has a bureaucracy. And so we have, dozens and dozens of these big bureaucracies managing healthcare rather than having one bureaucracy that's managing healthcare. What else would count? Well, certainly the way we plan, especially in America, the way we plan cities around cars, that's really wasteful. So in terms of environmental fine tuning, if you could take control of the economy, there are all kinds of things you could do that would be real savings in terms of what we spend energy and time on, and that could all be rediverted to something more productive and more useful. So this idea of measuring what counts as use. And along the way, I actually had to talk to somebody who knew something about fashion to figure out fast fashion. What the fuck is fashion? Sorry, what is fast fashion? What is this? And what I was told is, and I did have some awareness of this, when the people who create new ideas in fashion designers come up with a new idea, our productive systems and transportation systems are so fine-tuned that you could have someone with a new idea in Paris about, or actually I understand that France is actually a bad example, so let me use Italy or London, comes up with a new idea for some sort of fashion thing. And this seems to be much more applicable in women's fashion than men's fashion for some reason. Factories in East Asia, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Bangladesh, are going to be able to produce that item and have it in stores in a time frame that's measured in days, not even weeks, but days. And so it's become possible for what's going to count as fashionable, and this is going to be especially true for the teenagers, 20-somethings who are much more attuned to and feel much more social pressure to participate in this kind of cultural activity. But it's just an astounding waste of resources that this thing is going to become popular and show up in stores in a week, and then in 2 weeks won't be popular and will just be sitting in someone's closet, and now they're out buying something new. And so you're turning around the production of clothing on this astoundingly fast scale with all of the sort of environmental destruction that goes with producing clothes and dyeing clothes and then shipping clothes. and then the retail, the advertising for the clothes, and then the retail of the clothes. So I just, it was really astounding to discover just how big of a phenomenon that is in our culture.
And I add that it also extends to furniture and interior design and literally everything.
Oh my God.
Those online Chinese companies have branched out to that. Yeah.
On interior design. Oh my God.
Like all I can think of is Shine. I can't think of the other one right now, man.
Oh, wow.
You know what
All
I'm
right.
talking about? Yeah. So every
Okay.
trend.
All right. So yeah, Trent, this is definitely a bad idea that somehow we got to get away from. But these cultural things, the cultural habits are really hard to undo without, being overly forceful about it. If it's China, China can do these things because their government is a lot has that power and people are used to the government having that power. But you can't do that here. But how to anyway, the big problems that need to be undone.
Have a very different logic of accumulation afterwards. And then the second step is because the entire pie of the economy is no longer growing, or we don't seek after this expansion anymore as a primary goal, it is much more necessary to consciously share the existing wealth with other people. And here comes a very interesting idea of Marx. Marx says there is this abundance of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum, the commonwealth. He says in the future communist society, this flow, all the springs of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum will flow abundantly in the future society. Why? It's not because we can produce so much. This is often misunderstood as if Marx is demanding something like private jets for everyone. This is not a socialist politics that we can defend today. It is rather, he's saying this kind of commonwealth can be abundant, which means in today's society, everything is commodified. We have to pay for those commodities, no matter how important, essential they are for our lives. So if you don't have money, basically you are just excluded from the consumption of essential goods. But against this logic of commodification, we can introduce the logic of commonification. We introduce the commonwealth. More public transportation, more universal medical care, more public housing, and more free internet, everyone, that kind of things that are necessary, but they are artificially being scarce in capitalism because they're commodified, but we can sort of make it a common goods that everyone can have access to. So this is the new form of abundance that Marx is talking about in his Critique of Gotha program. And I think
I heard an economist the other day on a podcast I listened to talking about sort of how wages in China work. And when we hear people talk about how much Chinese people, especially in factories, are earning, it sounds like they must be the poorest people on earth. But what we're not noticing are all of the things that happen socially there that don't happen here. So workers in China don't have to pay for childcare. They don't have to pay for their medical care. They don't have to pay for their kids' education. They pay astoundingly little for transportation. Their housing costs are, in the housing sector, a lot of it is subsidized. And so the lifestyle of average Chinese worker has been radically improving. I mean, I heard something like it's improved 300% in the last 10 years on average. So 3 times their lifestyle has increased 3 times in 10 years. The kind of the ordinary comfort level of living. So it's an astoundingly powerful tool to have some of all of these, well, having all of those sorts of things socialized, because all of a sudden people really don't have to work so hard. especially if we organized it, using the kind of productive power that we have all over the world. You could imagine a world in which what was thought of as an ordinary work day was a 4-hour day, 3 days a week, something like that. That's all people really had to work, and the rest of the time would be their free time. And so the culture, especially our culture, has to make a really dramatic change in order to move away from the answer to the question, what are those people doing in their free time, being they go shopping, to an answer being something like they're playing music with their friends, they're going to the theater, they're spending time playing with their kids, and on and on and on. But it becomes all about lifestyle, as in life activities, rather than accumulation and stuff and how much stuff someone has. So it's a big change that he's talking about, and I think that's why it's sort of hard for people to imagine degrowth. They're like, we're going to stop caring about growing the economy. Yeah, exactly. We're going to stop caring about that. We're going to care about other things instead. And it's like, how do we do that? It's hard for people to imagine. And thus his notion that we need the humanities to be able to offer visions of what these kinds of things would look like. Okay, I just thought it was important to catch up with.
This vision of abundance is something I think we socialists can relatively easily accept, because public transportation, free public transportation, free education, free medical care. Of course, these things are more introduced in Germany compared to Japan or the US, but I think we can demand more of these things. And with these kind of reforms, so many people maybe in this room criticize me for not explicitly talking about revolution in my book. It's more like a reform, but it's more like a revolutionary realpolitik, or radikaler Reformismus, as Joachim Hirsch says. It's a kind of the intervention within capitalism. We have free public transportation, but it's still capitalism. But after many, many things become commons, I think that society and our behavior and consciousness and desire will fundamentally change, because we don't have to worry about satisfying our basic needs anymore. We don't have to always compete for jobs, because we can have something basic. So these are the things that I think we challenge some of the private property, and we don't leave what is essential to the market and price. We make the more common goods. So these are the things that are more or less missing in the liberal kind of the degrowth or steady state discussion. I think it is the socialist tradition that can contribute much more. But just we have to first abandon this skepticism about the term degrowth as a kind of form of austerity. People said that, especially in the US today. But I think we can imagine a new form of abundant society after overcoming the artificial scarcity of the commodification through commodification.
Thank you.
So the problem when he says people criticize him, the problem is in there is the question of how do we get from here to there, and traditionally in in socialist thought there have been two main answers. One is kind of the more mechanical view of looking at Marx, talking about capitalism collapsing. And so that's one part of how Marx thinks about things. It's not clear whether he thinks that's actually as powerful a factor as we want it to be or not. But the idea is that capitalism has these natural crises we call recessions and depressions, and they happen every 5 to 7 years. And it's the Marxist view of it is it's caused by something called a crisis of overproduction. So what happens is factories go about doing their thing. And when times are good for sort of the idea is things start to be looking good for them. And so they start thinking, well, we don't need as many people because everything's working well. So they lay off some people. But there's a cycle that can kick in with that if there are more and more people in the economy losing their job, then there's less demand in the economy. There isn't as much money for people to spend on things. And so all of the things that are being made start to be sold less and less. And so they're accumulating more and more because the factory keeps making more and more of them. And so you reach this point where you have a crisis of overproduction, where the factories have made too much stuff for the amount of demand in the economy because workers aren't making enough. But their response to that is just to lay off more workers because the individual factory owner can't control the whole economy. That person can only control their own factory. And faced with, okay, if we don't have enough money coming in to pay people, what do? Well, you got to let people go. So now more and more people are being let go. And so there's even more stuff accumulating in the economy, accumulating that's not getting sold. And so you have more overproduction. And that just creates this downward spiral that forces the economy into recession, or if it's really bad, into depression. And that seems to happen every 5 to 7 years. It's just a natural part. Ever since the history of capitalism, every 5 to 7 years, there's some sort of crisis. And generally, every 6 to 7 decades, it's a major crisis where the whole economy goes into a major slump, like in the 30s, and then sort of after the 2000s. In 2008 was kind of a similarly hard period. Not nearly as bad, but worse than the ordinary recession. So anyway, so the idea is that crisis would at some point become so big that the whole system would just collapse, the capitalist system. And there were a lot of people in the 30s who thought that we're there. That's it. This is it. Capitalism's over. The system's going to collapse. And now we're going to have to do something new. And what happened was capitalism was able to reinvent itself through the adoption of these mechanisms that John Maynard Keynes talked about. And those had all been taboo before, but faced with this huge crisis, all of a sudden, the capitalist class was willing to pay some taxes in order to do these things that Keynes was saying would generate demand and get the economy going again. And now it's generally believed that it's World War II that ultimately did that, because World War II was a huge demand on the economy. We need to produce all kinds of stuff for the war. So lots and lots of economic activity, and that really turned around the whole depression with the foundation that FDR had laid with the New Deal. So one idea is capitalism will just collapse. Eventually, one of these times the cycle will just get too big. They won't be able to, the capitalist class, its governments won't be able to respond. The system will just fall apart, and people will have to be forced to rebuild something new. Okay, so that's kind of a traditional Marxist view. Then Lenin comes along and says, okay, it seems like the system has found ways to be persistent that Marx may not have anticipated. And so we're going to need to do something else, like intervene directly in the process. So Lenin has these ideas about a revolutionary party and how you go about taking power and all of that. So you have this capitalism collapses idea that's then competing with Lenin's we're going to make a revolution idea. And then as sort of the third alternative, that's the kind of generally, at least a non-radical, it could still be socialist because it's what he's describing as reformist. You have another idea, which is, well, what if we didn't have to revolutionize the whole economy, but we could make gradual changes in it? And this is what the social democratic project is about. we can make changes in the economy such that we improve things over time. And what Saito's adding to that is in kind of a sort of revolutionary spirit is, well, if you make enough little changes in the economy over time, those are going to add up to a big change. Good Hegelian thinking. Enough change in quantity produces a change in quality. It's one of Hegel's laws of dialectics. So that's his theory is entirely relying on or based on that kind of thinking, that if we intervene little by little, but over time, cumulatively, we eventually make a qualitative change and we end up in this better space. The primary criticism of that is, how do you think this is going to actually happen, that the politics of capitalism are going to allow people to make these little changes that you're talking about? Which is the point that the Leninists are making, is that, yeah, if you could make little changes over time politically in the economy and such that they would add up, well, that would be all well and good, but the capitalist class isn't going to let you do that. That's why you have to have a revolution, is precisely because there's too much power allied against any of those changes. And in fact, and what those people would point to is the fact that we keep undoing all of the changes that we had made in the economy in that direction. And even the Scandinavian countries, social democracies, they're backsliding on the progress they made. They're not funding their healthcare systems as generously as they used to. They're not funding their education as much as they used to. And these days especially, they want to spend more on arms. So all of that's going to mean a decrease in those social democratic changes that could have added up to something. So those are kind of the three big positions on this. Can we make gradual change? Does it have to be revolutionary change? Or are we just going to rely on capitalism collapsing on its own? Okay.
I think you also talk about reduction of working hours as one of the benefits. Maybe you can explain that.
That's also something that the workers' movement and the degrowth movement can unite and fight together, because we are in the world where many things are commodified. So we need.
And I guess in defense of him, maybe it's worth me pointing out, the optimism that he has for this reformist project that he's laying out is I think that he thinks that if people who are interested in the socialist project, and people who are passionate environmentalists all got together, that could be sufficient political power to start to make these reformist changes he talks about. But so I think that's what he's relying on, and it's not. It's not entirely fantastical, this idea. It's just obviously really difficult because you have this problem of the capitalist class resisting. But if you have enough people in a movement, that movement can make change. So it's not totally bizarre. Which I think is why this argument keeps persisting, is each side has some points that are reasonable points to make in the debate, and it's hard to come to any kind of final conclusion about which one is ultimately really would be the ideal path to take. And so that's why you end up the three of them competing, which is kind of unfortunate, because if they also, people who had these three different ideas all cooperated better around one of them, that would also be a better approach. But, okay, politics is a problem.
So we have to work even extra hours, especially the wage is low and stagnant and the job is precarious. So we have to compete more with others. This is just creating the disaster for many people. And I think the socialists need to criticize this kind of situation. We have been doing this. But that doesn't simply mean we have higher wages, because even if we have higher wages, what if we start consuming the money for buying more fast fashions and eating more beef, and this is not something I think the environmentalism cannot really find well. So I think the improvement of the working condition need to be looked for somewhere else, and I think one of the very common ground is reducing the work hours. We introduce more of the commodification, commonwealth, decommodify many things. And we also work less. Like we can start, especially already in Europe, there are a lot of experiments about 4 working day kind of thing. But we could maybe try 3 working day and something like that. By reducing the number of hours, we will also slowing down the growth, but we are also decreasing the production of unnecessary goods. And we are also improving the welfare of working class because of this competition, the long work hours, and so on. This is not good because workers have to take care of their babies, and these are the things that can be more or better satisfied under socialist regime with degrowth kind of politics. So once we stop producing, or once we sort of starting giving up some of the excess things, not everything. I'm pro investing. I'm arguing for investing in more of renewable energies. I am arguing for investing more in electric vehicles. We need them. But at the same time, we cannot have infinite numbers. Now, we also have to think about reducing the total number of cars, of course, but we need a new technology. So I'm not anti-technologist, but I think, so again, coming back to the point, I think the shortening working hours is good for the environment, good for the well-being, so good for the workers, and they can spend more time for politics, learning new things, spending time with family, kids, friends, and doing sports. I don't know. I mean, so these are the things that are really good. Once we sort of redefine the idea of affluence, prosperity, away from the consumptionist lifestyle.
Okay, so
Another sort of point in his favor too. There's a longstanding idea that one of the big political problems that socialists talk about is if people work too much, they just don't have time for anything else. And so getting political programs going and building mass support for things is complicated by the fact that people have long work hours. So it becomes a radical and transformative idea that if they work less, that adds to the power of this kind of movement to make little changes over time that are going to add up to be big changes, because as people have more free time, they're then able to get more involved in these kinds of questions and see politics as something that's more directly related to their lives and therefore something that's worth spending time on. But if you're having to compete between sleeping and meetings, political meetings, because you're working so much, you're probably going to choose sleeping because you really need sleep, or things that are just going to be more fundamental in your life. So politics doesn't get the attention that it should in our culture because people are just working too much. So there's really a lot more radical potential in that idea of freeing up people's time than it sounds on the face of it, because this is one thing you allow them time to do is to organize.
So you just spoke about technological innovations, and I mean there are also eco-socialist currents who rely heavily on technical solutions, who say, for example, that once we have cheap, unlimited energy because we have built solar and wind energy properly, we can have socialist growth unlimited. So it already sounded like you're criticizing these approaches, but how exactly?
So I think one more thing about the socialist tradition is the international solidarity. It's very important for me too. And I think we could, so the countries like Germany and Japan could invest more and more in electric vehicles and renewable energies, and maybe we could reduce the emission to some extent. But the problem is it will not be fast enough. It will never reach the decarbonization by 2050, for example, because we have the production of bigger cars, more model changes, and these kind of excessive advertisement. they compel us to produce and consume more and more. So as long as I think this tendency continue, will be not successful. But I think this is a basic promise of Green Deal politics in the European Parliament, but also the Green New Deal among some of the left wing. One thing we have to make it clear is, as I said, we need, of course, electric vehicles, but the number should be reduced. So this is degrowth. We need to share the cars, and we also need to use more bicycles. Bicycle is a great technology, and we need to invest more in public transportation. So these things create jobs, and I think all in these terms, of course, there are some way of collaborating, labor movement and environmental movement, and so on. But I think it is very important to emphasize one more thing is if we try to grow with these green technologies, these technologies are also produced using metals, energies, and so on. So the extraction of the rare metals from Africa, Latin America, will be much more excessive. It's already happening in lithium production and so on. So it's also one of the responsibility for the global north. So it's just basic thesis of the environmental justice. For the global north, it is more responsible to reduce our consumption, just correcting the kind of imperial Lebensweise for the sake of making some room for the development of the global south. I think the global south, of course, needs more development for satisfying their basic needs.
Which means growth also.
Yes, which means growth, basically. So they use more energies, they use more resources, they also need them. But do we need more sports cars? Probably not. So I think this way of challenging the excessive consumption, and we need to, I mean, these kind of demands are already there, especially in Europe. The context is very different in Japan. People are more conservative. And so I think my friend said, I mean, your book is radical in Japan, but your book will be majority in Germany. That's what Marx Gabriel said. But
I'm not so sure about that. We'll see.
But so I mean, there are many attempts already, and I think this optimism of technology must be also corrected. Also, Marx didn't say that we should not use technology. He said when he said we need a higher form, it means that we use those technologies that have been developed under capitalism. So it's not about going back to nature, but that doesn't mean we can infinitely grow. So we just simply need to this distinction, and then the degrowth is not saying something very weird to us. It's something that we can relatively easily accept once we understand what they're saying without bias. I also had a bias for many years, but I think I hope that this will be some kind of the mediation for the traditional left wing to the environmental movement and degrowth movement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have to say, like, I find your arguments very convincing, and what you say about communism, you're welcome. But at the same time, I wonder how we can actually achieve this, because sometimes I feel like it's so hard already to convince people of green capitalism instead of just capitalism. For example, I mean, you talked about transport, and in Germany, there are so many people defending the combustion engine and don't see the electrical car as an alternative. And we all know that the electric car actually isn't an ecological alternative, and you described this very well in your book. But then I wonder if it's so hard to convince people to just switch the engine of their car, how can we convince them of these much more radical changes that you are proposing? Because I think in the end, it's not only about private jets, right? It would be nice if that's the case, but I think it isn't.
Yeah. So I was also thinking about this issue recently because we had many environmental movement uprising in 2018, 19, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and those things. And it continued a couple of years, but it didn't really transform the system. The system of fossil capital is so strong. So, I mean, the concrete strategy of bringing this kind of revolutionary subjectivity, it's something that we still have to look for. But I think the precondition for that is the unity or alliance of working class movement and degrowth environmentalist movement. But this is not emerging yet, even in Germany. So one proposal for me is first, make the idea of degrowth communism clear. Without some kind of idea, we cannot even try to achieve the goal. So I try to set some goal. How to achieve this goal is still hard. But I think one of the point, after reading this book, it is okay to criticize more explicitly capitalism. It's weird, people know that capitalism is in crisis, but we cannot say the word socialism or communism, especially like countries like Japan. People think that you are stupid, but it's because they don't have this idea. Once we have idea, we could question what would be a way to achieve this, or what would be a way to get closer to this goal. And I think that is why I often talk about concrete reformist policies. My book talks about a lot about Barcelona, Ada Colau, and she, of course, doesn't talk about communism. But Barcelona en Commun, so the Barcelona in common, this is a kind of the attempt to challenge some of the global capitalism and the EU, and then they try to get more of the autonomy and the participation and the equity for everyone in a sustainable way. And some of the measures that they introduced, but also there are other projects, reducing the car lane and then transforming it into the bike lane, and the kind of things are, very slow. We need to have more of them in a more massive manner. But at the same time, they will create some of the conditions for changing our behavior and consciousness, as I said, desire, from a consumptionist way, the bigger car is good, it's more convenient, to something that, okay, we need to have more equal transportation, and so on. And also reducing the working hours and that kind of things happening within capitalism today. But I think over the long run, we could utilize the socialists, environmentalists could utilize these ideas that are already accepted, many people in Europe especially. We could utilize them to have more radical reformation in the end. So it's a kind of a gradual transformation with a radical aim. So this is a radical reformism. I think this is one of the strategies, especially like countries like Japan. It's very important to have this reformist strategy because we don't have, unfortunately, a big movement. Even Fridays for Future is regarded as something very dangerous or something there. So in a conservative society, we need to have this kind of the concrete ideas within capitalism with the aim of overcoming itself.
Okay, so maybe one last question from me about this, and then we can open to the audience. So concerning this question about how to bring forward this this radical change, in your book, you also mentioned a study by the American political scientist Erica Chenoweth, who talks about, or which the study got famous as the 3.5% rule. Maybe you can explain this and why you're making this reference.
Okay, I mean, this idea has been, for example, criticized by my friend Andres Malm, and it's a little bit unpopular among the left-wing people. I also understand the reason, but at the same time, I think I wanted to end this book with some kind of positive messages in the readers in Japan who don't have genosen and genosinen around them. They are interested in ecological crisis. They're worried about ecological crisis. They want to do something, but other friends are apolitical. It's hard to talk about politics and climate change with friends. These are the situation in Japan. So we need to have some cultural understanding, the toleration of more, making the tone a little bit too mild. But I think this message of 3.5 thing is like, if very small number of people stand up, they could actually bring some fundamental change. And I think this is something we need. We need a kind of optimism of the will. And we can actually criticize it. This is really actually the way of denouncing violence, and this is extreme center and that kind of thing. But
Because the study is only about violent free protest,
yes,
right? Yeah.
yes. So they try to denounce other forms of violent social movements and so on, so on. Okay, I understand. But in Japan, violent social movements.
Yeah, they're actually, I think I meant to skip this part. They're spending a little bit too much time on this, but the basic what they're getting at is that the problem seems huge, but it turns out things can turn on a smaller number of people all doing the same thing than we might imagine. That the biggest mass movements we know about still involved small percentages of the population, and yet they could achieve really big things because there were just enough of them, and they're representing enough of what most people think that has power. So anyway, so that's the idea, is that he wants to just end with the optimism that yes, we need to organize, but maybe it doesn't actually require organizing everyone. Just need 3.5%. So it's an optimistic idea. Okay, this is where I want to end this one. Let's see what. So anyway, before I go on to the next one, any thoughts? Any questions?
He's extremely eloquent and he's very fluent in English, and it's sometimes hard for me to understand what he's saying. And what I was wondering, was he getting at the idea that possibly it's the very words communism, socialism, environmentalism, just those terms need to be different because people already have a preconceived notion about what they are. And people who hear the word communism will just go bananas without paying any attention to what we're really talking about. So maybe he wasn't talking about that.
No, I think he is, but it's not replacing them, it's more rescuing them. So bringing them back to ordinary usage. That's why he calls the book Degrowth Communism, is he's actually trying to normalize the word.
Degrowth. Never heard of that before. But communism, socialism, those just make people, they just have a stimulus that makes it hard to even talk about.
Yeah, but it's changed a lot over time. So it's a lot more of a generational thing than it used to be.
Right.
Used to be much more universal, but the younger generation seems to be a lot more open to these kinds of things.
And the idea of communism.
Yeah, well, and Sanders, I think his first campaign in 2016, Bernie Sanders, the fact that he calls himself a socialist, he really started to normalize that word, and so it's in ways that I never thought were possible. But I think a lot more of the general public, but especially the under 30 general public.
And it's true that it would be my parents would just really go berserk over the word communism. And so then my generation, all of the boomers have, I suppose, I don't know, same sort of, but
the generation, that didn't grow up in a Cold War, these things are all very different to them.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So it's, I can see with the places where he wants to point to optimistic possibilities. I mean, I can see he's pointing at real things. It's the open question is, are they enough? But they are real things, and so all of this is true. These things have changed and are changing, and people are more and more sensitive to environmental issues. That's changing. So it is moving in the direction he wants to go. Obviously we need to move it a lot faster to have more meaningful progress on keeping carbon out of the atmosphere. But at least there are those things moving in the right direction. Other things in politics maybe seem to be moving in the wrong direction at the moment. But but there are cultural things that are still moving in the right direction. Okay, anyone else?
I have thoughts, but I'll wait till after we hit this time at the end.
Sure. All right. So we'll do a little bit with this next one. So this one is I think it was part of a book launch. I think it's from the Haymarket bookstore conversation, but it's four four people talking. And this one I'm gonna stop and skip around a little bit. There's there are a few times where their conversation, so I think gets sort of into the weeds or off somewhere where it's just not helpful for my purposes. So I'm going to stop and start more with this one than I did with the others. Let me see if I can find it. Let's see, this one. Nope. Come on. All right. Maybe I need to get this queued up on my own here before I share it. There we go. I bet this will work. This one's, I think, is a year and a half later, maybe 2 years later. He looks different in this one. Interestingly enough. So there's four different people in this conversation. They've introduced themselves. The others are American professors, but they're starting the conversation with him. So we're just jumping in with him.
I made them in Japan, but now we can use Skype to connect to all over the world. And I want to present two of my books. One is Marx and the Anthropocene, and the other was Slow Down, which just came out in January. And these two books have very similar aim. One is more academic, the other is more for popular audience, but the aim is to present the idea of degrowth communism as a new political imaginary for the left, because this is something we really need, because in the age of climate breakdown, capitalism is an obvious root cause, and we need to challenge capitalism. And luckily, there are many post-capitalist imaginaries recently, from eco-modernism to degrowth. And basically, my book's intervention in this debate from a Marxist socialist side. And traditionally, there are many discussions on this kind of topic, but famously enough, there's a long-lasting antagonism between green environmental movements on the one hand and the red workers socialist movements on the other hand. And fortunately, this antagonism has been somewhat resolved by people like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Bucket, who recently passed away. And I also did my...
John Bellamy Foster is a big name, American name in this conversation, and someone was sort of a precursor actually for what Saito's doing. And if we have time, there's a video with him, with Foster, I want to show you, but that'll be probably week 8 to wrap things up and sort of bring it for full circle by coming back to where it was 20 years, because Foster has been doing this for 20 years, these ideas about green Marxism.
Intervention in my last book, my previous book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, which was published from Monthly Review Press, by looking at Marx's own unpublished notebooks. He actually very intensively studied natural sciences at the time. He read, for example, Justus von Liebig, the agricultural chemistry, and he analyzed how modern capitalist agriculture actually creates a serious disruption in the metabolic interaction between humans and nature. And he demanded that capitalism cannot solve this metabolic rift. So we need to make a transition to a more sustainable planned society, which we call eco-socialism.
Yeah, he didn't use that term as much in the last one, but metabolic rift is definitely the most vital concept in all of this. That human society has to have this relationship with the natural world, and capitalism gets it all out of whack in ways that are totally unsustainable. But we know from history, humans have had sustainable relationships with their environment. Excuse me. Of course, we've also had histories of unsustainable relationships with our environment. Um, the most sort of interesting example of that I encountered recently, I didn't realize this before, was that there are a lot of people now think that the decline of the Mayan civilization was entirely to do with they cut down all the trees
Mm-hmm.
in the Yucatan and they built this amazing society. You know, the biggest cities in the Mayan Empire were I think 2 or 3 times the biggest cities in Europe at the time. You know, so amazing accomplishments in building human civilization. And then it just sort of all of a sudden collapses, and people for a long time, you know, couldn't figure out quite why, because it collapsed before the Spanish arrived. I think originally people thought it was the Spanish, but then realized no, the times don't line up. But it's sort of later you get these get environmental models, and I think it took was especially some satellite work that NASA did making predictions that if the Yucatan didn't have any trees, what would happen to the rainfall patterns? And then just the rain goes away, and you know, and that was what happened is the rain went away, and they rely on these cenotes, these you know, limestone wells for water there because the Maya were the only major civilization in human history to not be built next to a river because they had all these cenotes, but no rainfall. The water level in the cenotes just keeps going down and down and down, and it's harder to get, and everything starts dying and environmental collapse. So anyway, so we have history of smaller scale, you know, those communes, right, being sustainable over long periods of time. But we also know that big conglomerations of human beings has a way of being environmentally destructive too. So it's something that we need to be much more intentional about, should be the lesson from history.
So my book was titled Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, and it got Deutsche Pride and so on. However, I had at the time two serious problems. One is basically, so even if I or Foster Burkett demonstrated Marx was an ecological thinker, some people said, so what? You know, it's 19th century science, you know, only dogmatic Marxists care about what Marx said. So for people like me, it's important that Marx was an ecologist, but for many left-wing people or for liberal people, it doesn't matter whether Marx was an ecologist or not. That was one criticism. But my response basically in these two recent books, Marx and the Anthropocene and Slowdown, is no, it's important because based on his analysis of metabolic risk and, you know, environmental destruction and so on, we can imagine a new future. Without Marx's ecology, we cannot have a thorough critique of contemporary climate breakdown and so on. And I wanted to demonstrate how his theory is useful in order to comprehend today's climate crisis and so on. And secondly, there was another tension, even after overcoming the tension between green and red. The tension that existed was the tension between eco-socialism on the one hand and degrowth people. Because many socialists still believe that more technology, more innovations, more growth are necessary for any kind of emancipatory socialist politics. And they also believe that the degrowth is not critical enough of capitalism, and degrowth is only for rich people. And, you know, so they believe that the degrowth is not really useful for working class movements and the people in the global south and so on. And on the other hand, degrowth people criticize, like before, that the socialists are basically only concerned about growth and technology, and that they are basically productivists. And that's true to some extent, because some socialists argue like that when they especially criticize degrowth people. But I believe that this tension is very unfortunate, because today, even degrowth people recognize that the capitalism is very problematic, and they also demand more radical transformation to the economic system, while socialists often stick to their own old tradition. Then the dialogue doesn't take place. And I wanted to kind of overcome this tension in order to build a wider new anti-capitalist front in the age of climate breakdown. So that was my project. And this is a result presented in the Marx in the Anthropocene. That was a little bit hard because, in looking at the tradition of Marxism, there was always very optimistic belief in terms of developing or increasing productive forces will one day blow up capitalist mode of production, so that all the traditional historical materialism is indeed very productivist, always increase of productive forces first, and then we will solve other problems, including ecological degradation. But if you look at Marx's own discussion, he changes his ideas over time because he was also studying new things, and one is exactly natural science. And once he recognized ecological question, the ecological degradation under capitalism, and this view only came to his mind around 1860s, so relatively late, around the time of preparing for volume 1 to 3 of Capital, he recognized that actually this kind of increase of productive forces and technology.
Right. Now, remember that they write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He's now talking about 1860. Marx died in 1888. So it's getting towards the end, very much towards the end of his life. It is what's going on.
Technologies are only strengthening, reinforcing robbery from nature. It is not bringing emancipation. It is not realizing any kind of sustainable society. It is simply robbing nature of its wealth, right? So he started to question his old assumption about traditional historical materialism. And then he also started to take a look at pre-capitalist societies again. Once in the 50s, he was more optimistic. All those pre-capitalist society will be destroyed by capitalist imperialism. That's bad, but one day there will be also revolution and socialism will spread all over the world and so on. But in the 70s, when he studied countries like Russia and America, indigenous communities and Poland and so on, he came to recognize actually that this society, the people are not only equal, because they regulated all the kind of production on communal level, but also this kind of society remained stable for many, many years, in some cases, thousands of years, because the society, the community itself is very sustainable. While capitalism transforms itself all the time, but then they're also destroying the entire planet. So when he compared these two kind of different kinds of dynamism of social reproduction, he came to recognize in the end, actually, pre-capitalist society had some kind of economic superiority, and he even demanded in his letter to Dasovich that Western capitalism must go back, must return to the higher stage of pre-capitalist society. So he said that the Western capitalist countries need to learn from pre-capitalist non-Western societies, and then there will be future. Not simply going back to, low technology kind of thing, return to the higher stage. And then
now that's the same Russian woman he was talking about before, about this same letter. But it just occurred to me in terms of sustainability that one thing someone might point out is that feudalism was remarkably stable. For like 1,000 years in Europe, there was this one system and it just persisted and it was very, very stable until capitalism disrupted it. So anyway, it just occurred to me he's not quite referencing the equality part of the goal of the values as much as he perhaps should, to head that observation off, because Marx would have known that too, that feudalism was very sustainable and persisted over very long periods of time. But it's based on this fundamental inequality, and since his whole project is about egalitarianism, it's sort of like anathema to think about feudalism as a model. So he very much wants to is going to be attracted to, I guess I should say, because he discovers them. He's going to be attracted to models that are going to be egalitarian, regardless how much someone could point out that feudalism was also sustainable. But it's not humanly sustainable because it's so abusive to human beings. But it was environmentally sustainable in its time. Just occurred to me.
He said, yes, 1 minute left. He said that in the communist societies, all the springs of commonwealth, genossenschaftliche Reichtum, the commonwealth, flow more abundantly. Here, I find a new form of abundance flowing out. It is not a private jet for everyone. It is more about education, medical care, services, food, electricity, and these essential goods must be communally owned, decommodified, and that kind of public luxury, public abundance is the basis of communism. And then it is not necessary to always seek after economic growth. And that transformation he made in the very last stage of his life is the foundation of degrowth communism. And this is something what we today, the left, need to embrace and put forward as a new emancipatory alternative politics.
All right. Well, there's the four of them.
Thank you, Kohai. Gene, you're
There's the conversation that follows I didn't find very interesting. So this is one
up
of the
next.
spots.
Holly, you're up next. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm just going to reflect on this book, Marx and the Anthropocene. But congrats on the new one. I haven't read it yet. And
There we go.
To respond to anything, elaborate, etc. Please.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Holly and Dan, first of all, for reading my book and giving a wonderful comments. And yeah, exactly that kind of conversation and dialogues I wanted to have. So I'm really happy for this occasion today. And I think one of the things that I wanted to respond is that the degrowth is not actually about going back to agrarian communism. That Marx was inspired by those agrarian communes doesn't mean that he idealized it as a kind of vision for future. He is getting some inspirations for envisioning a higher type of communism. And so that's not actually going back to the nature, which means that it's not about negating all the kind of technologies as aiming for absolute domination of nature. His point is basically under capitalism, as you rightly pointed out, Holly, under this capitalist social relations, technologies are often developed for the sake of dominating people, dominating nature. So it is often associated with Prometheanism. But I would say that there are many ways that in another kind of social relations, like a socialist relations of production, we can have complex technologies that are non-dominant, that can be more democratically managed. And these are the things that, for example, renewable energies are obvious example that we definitely need in order to realize decarbonization. So degrowth people are actually demanding massive investment in renewable energies, electric vehicles, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we aim for infinite growth. And we can also talk about reducing number of cars. We can also reduce general consumption of energy and so on, so that we can have something like a universal basic energy for everyone. And we can debate about the nuclear energy because I don't actually support nuclear energy after the experience of Fukushima in Japan. So in a sense, the degrowth people demand dissolution of that kind of gigantic centralized kind of technology, which Andre Gold characterized as lock-in technology. And we can have some kind of open technology that can be more democratically managed, even though it's complex. I mean, there are many ways, I would say. I'm not a specialist of technology, but it's at least possible to imagine something like that. But we need to add that this also must be sustainable. There can be democratic technologies that are aiming at absolute domination of nature. So, simply open doesn't mean it's sufficient. It doesn't mean sustainable. So we need to have a very different kind of technology that we can have in degrowth kind of society. So I think that people like Matt Huber also sometimes misunderstand that point. It's not about negation of technology, going back to agrarian society, and it's not about austerity, but it is about negation of absolute domination of nature, negation of infinite economic growth, and then negation of those fundamental desires. It's connected to the question raised by Dan. It is the negation of some of our core values that we actually take consciously or unconsciously from capitalist system. For example, the material consumption, and we should have. We should own cars and so on. And it's also very hard. The degrowth is about distinguishing necessary and unnecessary things, and we consciously plan to reduce those unnecessary things so that we can stay somehow within planetary boundaries. But who would decide what is unnecessary? For some people, I say, SUVs are not necessary, but for some people, maybe they feel strongly that they are necessary for their lives. So the negation of meat, negation of big cars, negation of air flights could be very aggressive, and it could appeal as undemocratic. So it is hard indeed, as Dan pointed out, to imagine or start actually some kind of degrowth politics in a concrete way. It's hard to motivate people, especially for the people in the global north. But at the same time, unless we challenge this difficult task, the crisis is so huge. So the solution must be difficult too. My hesitation about Green New Deal is like people like Robert Pauling said, the crisis is so huge, but then invest 1% of our GDP in renewable energies, and then the problem will be solved. So it's not that hard. Okay. You said it's an existential crisis of civilization and human beings, but then the solution, Green New Deal, sounds so easy. I think the solution also has to be something difficult, and this is a very challenging task. We need to talk about motivation, agency, and a re-evaluation of value system. But that's something that we need to discuss right now because it takes time, but I think this is a very important starting point.
Okay, so I'll stop that there. On the technology one, the economist Richard Wolff has a great example that we're talking about. The technology is not necessarily good or bad. It's all about how does it get used. And the example he likes to use is, imagine a factory owner gets a hold of some technology that enables him or her to double the productivity of the workforce. And so what is the capitalist response to that? Lay off half the workers because you don't need them. But what is the socialist response to that? Cut the workday in half.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that and this is what people get confused with the Luddites. The original Luddites were not anti-technology. Their problem was how the technology was being used to get rid of their jobs. So that was the issue. So same point. The technology itself is not good or bad. It's how it's used. Who controls the technology that determines whether it will be a good thing or a bad thing socially. All right, so we're near the end. Jane, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, probably too many to so back when he was talking about interventions, points of intervention, and it sounds a little bit like incrementalism, but regardless of that, I just think about, the example that is the one that, my passion is universal health care, and I've been working towards that for a long time. And the way in which any incremental effort is co-opted, I'm thinking about the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. It was a huge boon for the health insurance industry. They made so much money from that.
Right.
On the national level. On the Washington level, our legislature introduced something called Cascade Care, which was supposed to plug the hole for people who are in the gap between Medicaid eligible and, still couldn't afford insurance. Again, a huge boon to insurance companies. Every effort to try and, just make a little change in that is the capitalist economy resists everything. Anyway, that was just my one thought, and I'm done.
No, that's part of the argument for revolution is yeah, you can make incremental changes, but they just get undone. So you don't actually end up making progress. That's why we need
They benefit the wrong people. They don't benefit who they are intended to.
Or they benefit the wrong people. Yeah, so this is a tough nut to crack. This problem. It's a big one. It's hard to organize a revolution. It's hard to organize reformist change too. So since both of them are hard, it's not like one of them is inherently easier than the other. But the arguments are often about which can ultimately can the reformists really succeed or not. And there are arguments about maybe it could if you get enough pressure, you just keep building it, but it's a problem.
Jane, did you turn yourself off on purpose? We can't see you.
Oh no, I didn't. Sorry.
Oh, I thought it was probably a sunlight problem you were having.
It might be.
Okay, anybody else have some thoughts?
I have a totally off the wall question for Jane.
Sure.
What does it say on your shirt?
It says Pine Hill Haints. It's a band.
Oh, see, I went to an elementary school called Pine Hills. So
well, yeah. Maybe who knows? Maybe they went to school together. I don't know.
I got it.
All right. Okay, well, I'll let you go. We'll reconvene next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.